Reza's been working on racism and Islamophobia, how young people are navigating that in the education system, and here to just talk about decolonisation today. Thank
you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Quite a great introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Can I just start by again thanking Javiria, Erica, and the team. I think you guys have done a wonderful job. Really rich morning and afternoon session. I've certainly learned a lot, and also so well organized. If academics had organized this, the lunch would have been served somewhere in the city center, and it would have been 5 p.m. already. And yeah. So I'm conscious that I'm sort of starting a bit later, but as they say on your Ryanair flight, I'll try and catch up. Hopefully this will be less painful than a Ryanair flight, but we'll see how it goes. So I've kind of last minute, really, I've called the lecture Destructive Knowledges because while it's true that colonialist epistemologies and knowledges have been and continue to be very destructive in the world, I also think this is a moment where decolonization is in a position to reinscribe knowledge, but crucially also to produce knowledges of its own that can systematically target and actually destroy the legacy of colonialism. I'm of course aware that the imagery of destruction is quite violent and being associated with decolonization, but I think it's probably important given how dangerously common far-right politics and sort of alpha male politics has become in the UK, across the global north, and in many other parts of the world. I guess in essence, what I'm trying to do is to put decolonization to work in a more focused manner. And that's kind of what this lecture is about. So for the sociologist Gurminder Bhamra and her colleagues, decolonization has 2 references. Firstly, it's centrally focused upon empire, colonialism, and racism, which it takes as its objective and discursive, discursive and empirical objects of study. It's kind of concerned with the ways these have shaped the world, while themselves remaining hidden from view often. And secondly, it also aims to offer us alternative ways of thinking, including new modalities of political and indeed educational praxis. And my lecture today hopes to address both reference. I want to first explore some of the contemporary dynamics of prejudice that have been animated by the legacies of empire, racism, and colonialism, and how these have then in turn mutated through history to gain their own unique forms today. Secondly, I hope to say something about how we might begin to do things a little bit differently. Specifically through what I think of as the meaningful inclusion of diverse communities in our education and research. I want to try and make 2 arguments, time permitting. One, that we absolutely must rigorously study specific forms of prejudice and then devise tailor-made solutions to them under the aegis, under the umbrella of decolonization and social justice. And 2, that we have to do all we can to meaningfully include diverse non-academic stakeholders in our research and teaching. I think this will help us move towards what I've been sort of thinking of as living diversity, which is kind of a diversity that corresponds more accurately to empirical lived reality, rather than a kind of a curated diversity, which I'll come on to talk about. Before getting on to all of that, I want to start by saying something broadly about the decolonization movement itself. I think it's safe to say that I'm in general agreement with relatively recent articulations of decolonization, and I've been really, I've been educated today by listening to and seeing all the different ways that people have conceptualized decolonization, and I really wholeheartedly agree with all of that. The Kiel Manifesto is often held up as a kind of a good, kind of pithy articulation, and I think there's a lot of really wonderfully articulated ideas in that manifesto. So, for example, on decolonizing the curriculum, this is an oft-cited, passage that all of you will probably be familiar with, which sort of focuses on dialogue and about imagining and envisioning things differently. And I think it's important just to highlight, because right off the bat, we need to establish that decolonization is not about having a go at Western science or discrediting it, or dismissing the achievements of Western science or attacking it or anything like that. In fact, I think as we move forward, hopefully this kind of binary Western science, Eastern science, I think part of the hopefully the achievement of decolonization will be to kind of break that down. And I think a lot of what a lot of us are doing who are in Western institutions but fighting for decolonization hopefully will contribute to that. I also think it's important just to remember, just in the interest of starting from a sort of common perspective, from a common starting point, that decolonization and many of its satellite concepts remain quite difficult. They can be unpacked and very kind of multifaceted and even very contested. Even the concept of the curriculum, which possibly is quite monolithically presented in the Kiel Manifesto. I mean, other people variously have defined curriculum as a set of processes, a set of contexts, a form of praxis. It's not necessarily just a list of topics that comprises a module. But more importantly, there are those who oppose using the language of decolonization in the context of education at all, right? So for Tuck and Yang, for example, the idea they're critical of using the language of decolonization because for them, it turns the concept into a metaphor. So for them, colonization essentially, in its essence, is about the illegal appropriation, occupation, stealing of indigenous lands. This is not a metaphor. This is a very real, concrete process. So therefore, decolonization must only refer to the undoing of that process. In fact, they'd go as far as to suggest that using the language in the context of education and social justice as we do is effectively another form of settler appropriation, right? The very strong and potentially compelling argument. But I think although the occupation, the stealing of lands is clearly a central injustice and a central problem, colonialism and coloniality are about more than that. Through colonialism, Western modernity has reshaped the entire world in social, political, cultural, and epistemological and economic terms. And we also know from the work of people like Frantz Fanon about the potential psychological impacts that it has and continues to have. And it's key, as many speakers have pointed out today, it's very important also to recognize that it has an ongoing influence. It keeps happening, it has many tentacles. And so that's clearly one of our key tasks as students and scholars of decolonization, is to really painstakingly study these ongoing influences and really understand them as well as we can. And if somebody was to throw open the question, well, how do you decolonize the university? Not sure how helpful a question that is, but I suppose at least a part of the answer to that would be, well, the university isn't separate from the rest of the world. As long as global socioeconomic relations remain what they are, I don't really see how universities can become decolonized. And that, again, is also part of our responsibility as members of the university to contribute to global decolonization more broadly. So therefore, I often think of decolonization as a guiding principle, as a kind of a point of departure rather than a point of arrival necessarily. To me, it's often a gateway, a moment perhaps, that frames and contextualizes historical and extant social relations between the West and the non-West. It offers perspective and truth, both of which I think are in quite short supply today. It compels us to address past injustices, but is also about recognizing current injustice and the possibilities of future injustice, and of course also of justice. And I think the power of this moment lies in the fact that it invites everyone towards deeper reflection and reflexivity. I often see the decolonial moment as essentially or initially an introspective moment. So as I alluded to before, in my own work, two areas of this ongoing complexity have been of particular interest. And I'd now like to look at each of them in turn as a way to try and find kind of pathways towards these, counter-destructive knowledges. So firstly, I've been interested in the ways that processes of racialization, de-theologize Christian culture and secularism all of which were significantly reshaped and gathered momentum during the colonial period, have worked to produce what we today refer to as Islamophobia. To take just one example of the complex historical entanglements at play, Robert Iverme's study of the British Raj is instructive. He writes that until 1830, the colonial government in India endowed Muslim and Hindu education. But under pressure from evangelical and utilitarian forces in Britain, it withdrew its support for Indian religions. During the 1850s, the term secular became adopted into policy, and the government concerned itself only with providing secular education in India, which of course meant teaching only Western sciences, Western works of literature, and so on. Now, this went hand in hand with notions of progress, a modernist notion of progress, and the so-called improvement of Indian lands and peoples. And it's clear that secular in this context simply meant not Hindu and not Muslim. The Christian roots of secularism itself were, of course, not questioned, nor was the continued influence of Christianity in Western culture, politics, and education. Although a codified body of law was essential to this project, the most important mechanism was the creation of a rapid expansion of a secular education system, which happened throughout the latter part of the 19th century. This was seen as the best way to create a new modern anglicized Indian subject whose Hindu or Muslim identity had been surpassed or superseded by his or her modern subjectivity. Now, one of the responses to this rapid secularization was the establishment outside the formal education system of networks of religious instruction, some of which, in the case of Muslim madrasas, grew increasingly reactionary and conservative over time. I think it's important to acknowledge that there was a kind of an anti-colonial edge to this so-called reactionism. But it's also important to acknowledge, as much as Western governments hate to be reminded of this, that what we today refer to as so-called Islamism or Islamist extremism is also causally related or linked to this colonial history. And not just in India either. There's evidence that Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia developed as an anti-colonial project. Iran's Islamic Revolution of 1979 happened nearly 100 years after struggles against rapid Westernization and colonialist style interventions. As I've explored elsewhere in my own work, for example, in this paper, Islamophobia is partly the response today, is partly the response of some non-Muslim people's kind of response to the perceived threat of Islamism, or it's the result of that response. Another part of it is, of course, rooted in Orientalism and in good old-fashioned racism. And since 9/11, that response has been systematized and concretized in policies and indeed in laws, such as the prevent duty here in this country, which has been pretty much copy-pasted in many other countries, many other parts of the world as well. And there's plenty of evidence that this kind of policymaking has only bred more and further Islamophobia. I'll come back to that shortly. Today, one concrete educational outcome of Islamophobia is that sadly, students of Muslim backgrounds are the lowest attaining students in UK universities by some margin. We know for a fact that this is happening in the UK because HESA, the Higher Education Statistics Agency, have released data, national data to that effect, disaggregated by religion, not just by race and ethnicity. I suspect it'll also be the case elsewhere across the global north. Now, this is clearly an important injustice, an educational problem in higher education today. And so when people like me think about, well, how do you deal with this? Again, my sort of main go-to is the decolonization movement. I think the decolonization movement, by virtue of the fact that it is student-led, and I can't stress this enough, is perhaps the most serious, the most viable movement we have to addressing this injustice. And this is why it's important that we study specific forms of prejudice and that we don't make the mistake of falling back on existing kind of strategies. I mean, if you think about the existing strategies, things like the BAME, the BAME agenda or the EDI agenda or the internationalization agenda or any other agenda, none of these are quite suitable to deal with this particular problem. Take, for example, the fact that some Muslim students are white, right? There are many white converts to Islam, right? They don't automatically fit under the BAME agenda. Yet there's also really good research to show that upon converting to Islam, white people become re-racialized as having almost become brown. So the racism and the Islamophobia that they experience is every bit as real as that experienced by someone that looks like me. Most Muslim students here or in many other UK campuses are not international. They're from the immediate vicinity of the university, actually, right? So we can shout and scream all we want about internationalization. We are not covering that group of people, and so on and so forth. Let's also not forget that these sort of well-established kind of umbrella strategies are also subject to institutional and political caprice, whim, right? Ministers, vice chancellors might go to bed tonight feeling one way, and then they wake up in the morning, having had a nightmare about something, and then the policy changes direction. You all know how that works. As for decolonization, I don't think we can expect, perhaps trust, institutions to do right by the decolonization movement. This is why it's so important that it remain a student-led movement, right? And if you wanted any kind of evidence of that, Fazana Shane and her colleagues wrote an excellent paper on this, where they summed up, generally what has been the institutions in the UK, universities' responses to decolonization. And these are the three main responses. Suffice it to say that none of these are what students want. These are all not the right things. Right? They're very critical of them, and rightly so. So therefore, I think decolonization cannot work through catch-all solutions or absolute notions of best practice. I think it's only once we analyze specific forms of prejudice like Islamophobia, understand their particular dynamics, and then devise tailor-made solutions under the umbrella of decolonization that we can get somewhere. In the case of Muslims, I've argued that both racism and religification are the problem. That's where the issue, I think, that's what's at the heart of that problem. In the case of dealing with the racism aspect in the previous paper, the previous slide, I've argued that critical race theory is particularly powerful in helping us to deal with the racism aspect of Islamophobia, partly because it gives us tools like storytelling, not trivial fictionalizing, but sort of living analyses of people's sociopolitical positions in the form of narratives. Or it gives us theoretical tools. I mean, somebody mentioned interest convergence before, like, there you go, yes, like that, right? Which enables us to study the relationship between vested interest and students' interests. And this in turn allows students to ask the right questions, the germane questions of their institutions, and hold them to account in the right way, rather than sort of these vague notions of EDI or even decolonization. Religification is about understanding how a monolithic and essentially illusory form of religiosity has been manufactured, rationalized, and then thrust upon a very diverse group of people that have come to be known as the Muslims. Through policies such as PREVENT and institutional privileging of secularism and Christianity, especially in the ethos and the cultures of the more prestigious universities, and through tropes of colonialism and Orientalism, this reified, illusory religiosity has come to be associated with terrorism, extremism, backwardness, irrationality, misogyny, homophobia, et cetera, et cetera. So the list is sadly very long. And I talk in that paper about what does that mean if you're a student who's coming from a Muslim background and you suddenly find yourself in a space that is kind of structured in that manner. If you are interested in reading more about critical secular studies, my good friend and colleague, Carl Kitching, have just written this paper and published it, which might be of interest to you. So Islamophobia has unique features that have mutated through its history and its links with colonialism. And studying this history, but also focusing on its unique kind of dynamics today, allows us to see how it's manufactured and how it works through education. And in turn, it gives us the opportunity to deal with it much more effectively. Okay, now on to the second bit. So secondly, I've been concerned with how research and thinking and also educational praxis can become more collaborative and community inclusive. This is something that my empirical research is obsessed with, pretty much. We all know that a lasting legacy of colonialism is that it draws a sharp line between those whom it properly authorizes to know and to act, and those whose knowledges are deemed to be without value, or invalid indeed. And I think we can do more to redress that imbalance. I want to argue that approaching issues of diversity in education without the meaningful inclusion of diverse non-academic communities and stakeholders has led to a sort of museumification of diversity. And I think that's not a good thing. We have to move towards living diversity. So as I said, diversity that corresponds more readily to empirical reality. To do so, we have to prevent the university from becoming a museum of diversity in the traditional sense, i.e. a space where a reified and idealized diversity is curated, displayed, and studied. In describing museums as contact zones, James Clifford invites us to think about museums not as repositories of exoticized cultures. That, he says, is very much a product of the colonial encounter. Museums are often situated at the hearts of imperial centers like Birmingham or London. And these then house, they render intelligible, they interpret the exotic cultures of the frontier, of the periphery, this kind of colonialist language. Instead, he thinks of museums as places where centers become borders crossed by objects and makers. Clifford gives the example, I mean, he gives many examples. One of them, a very powerful one, I think, is the example of the, apologies if I'm mispronouncing, I don't know if I am, the Tlingit community, I think, a tribe, a Native American tribe. And the Tlingit are invited to a museum in the Pacific Northwest, the tribal elders are, to essentially go and kind of view, review, and comment on some of the artifacts that pertain to their culture. So the museum lays them out. This is a very white museum, lays them out and invites the tribal elders to come as a sign of respect, to kind of contextualize them, to give us a bit of background into what these mean, essentially help us understand them, and give us a bit of context. And they're very much presented as works of art, beautiful works of art. It's very interesting that when the tribal elders come, they don't really pay that much attention to the artifacts. They become much more interested in singing, telling stories, interacting with each other and with everybody else in the museum. And two, they don't see these artifacts as art. They refer to them instead as records, as history, and as law, right? So it's a completely different understanding and framing of these artifacts. In fact, the artifacts were completely inseparable from tribal myths and stories, which are themselves intertwined with important analyses of current sociopolitical issues, such as colonialism and dispossession. Allowing for these realities to exist means repositioning the museum as a space of reciprocity and critical dialogue. So Clifford writes that the objects provoked, called forth, brought to voice, ongoing stories of struggle from the position of the collecting museum. This was a disruptive history which could not be confined to providing past tribal context for the objects. The museum was called to a sense of its responsibility, its stewardship of the objects. The museum was asked to be accountable in a way that went beyond mere preservation. It was urged to act on behalf of Tlingit communities. There's, of course, also the very important role that capitalism, or somebody said neoliberalism, plays in all of this, which unfortunately I don't have time to explore adequately. But there is a convincing argument that museums have also increasingly become places of consumerism, in what Clifford and others have referred to as a global department store of culture. One of the hallmarks of this condition is that history has given way to heritage. And this is really, really dangerous, because this new consumerist notion of heritage is one that must be celebrated and defended at all costs. But we cannot lose sight of history as a site of political struggle and contestation, and also of truth, might I add, right? And this is, I think, a crucial thing to keep in mind, because this kind of fetishization and obsession with heritage is exactly the sort of logic that allows many right-wing commentators today to claim that Britain's colonial past is nothing to be ashamed of. Right? In fact, it should be celebrated. We should teach more of it about it in schools and so on and so forth. I think a similar sort of museumification of cultures, of identities, of diversity is happening in education, in schools and universities. For example, the sociologist of education, Carol Vincent, has written about oversimplified and caricatured notions of Britishness, such as using pictures of the Queen and fish and chips and tea and stuff like that as kind of markers of British values and British identity. But she also talks about the idea of stereotyping minoritized pupils based on what the school perceives them, what their needs to be. So the school has perceptions or prejudgments about their perceived needs, and it sort of, and those prejudgments are what determine the school's approach to diversity and inclusion. So for example, South Asian students, once upon a time, these kids were kind of ethnically categorized and seen as passive and studious, hardworking Asians. Now, since then, many of them have become reclassified as Muslims, which means that they're now seen through the counter-extremism lens and seen as potentially in danger of being radicalized, and so, maybe extremists, and so on and so forth. And so this means that in some areas, the schools have now sort of shifted their position and really now, focus on teaching these kids about the values of tolerance. This is what it means to be a British person, and so on and so forth. Universities too are often sites of displaying and studying diversity, but without that diversity making any difference to how things are done. This is partly because diversity is not really reflective of the real world, and it is not equally or proportionally distributed across the university. You guys all know the stats about how less than 1% of professors are Black, very few leaders are of color, and the higher up the kind of prestige ladder you go, the worse it gets, and so on and so forth. In fact, we could argue that through certain student and staff recruitment directives, universities curate a particular sort of diversity. One that is very manageable and one that doesn't rock the boat too much. This often involves employing people of color to strategic race equality roles. But this will not be effective. As Sarah Ahmed has written, and she wrote this way before decolonization was in, back in the early 2000s, she says that the speech acts that commit the university to diversity are non-performative. They work precisely by not bringing about the thing that they describe. That is, describing the university as diverse and equal has come to replace actual meaningful diversity, producing policy documents that ostensibly acknowledge the university as a place of racial and religious inequality end up counting as progress and as achievements in and of themselves. So she writes, for example, that being committed to anti-racism can function as a perverse performance of racism. You are wrong to describe us as uncaring and racist because we are committed to being anti-racist. Anti-racism functions here as a discourse of organizational pride. So I suggest that we have to reposition universities as contact zones, much in the way that Clifford imagines it. What I particularly like about Clifford's conception is the idea of big Western institutions like museums and universities being held to account as stewards, not as owners or judges, being responsible and crucially being made to act on behalf of disenfranchised and minoritized communities. Arguably, they're doing the opposite today. They do much more to defend the legacy of colonialism, which isn't surprising given how much they've benefited and continue to benefit from that relationship. So the sort of thing that Clifford talks about is also something that I've come across in some of the work that I do myself. These are portraits taken by the wonderful Vanley Burke for a project that I've been leading for the past couple of years. I'm really pleased that we've just secured another 150 grand to do some more work in this area. If you are interested, I mean, this slide doesn't do them justice. There will be an exhibition of all of these portraits in the Exchange, running from some date in July until some date in September. I can find the details. July to September. You can pop in and you know, and then there's also an event where Vanley and I will be having a chat about some of this work, which you might want to come to. But it's really interesting. I mean, part of what this was about was to try and understand how people came to be Brummies. These are all people who have kind of a migrant background, but they're all, you know, denizens of Birmingham. And we sort of asked them for their stories and their life stories. And it was really interesting that instead of giving us chronologies of, you know, I was born here, then that happened, people kind of went back and forth in time and space, essentially to make sense of what it meant to be a Brummie, you know, to tell us about the here and now, to complain about education and the economy and things like that. We also asked them to sort of show us objects that really matter to them. And instead of, you know, coming up with really kind of romantic objects, people just brought everyday extensions of themselves, like the bike that somebody uses to make deliveries and to make a living, or the boxing gloves, which had to do with mental and physical well-being, and also a sense of being able to speak and so on and so forth. And so this is, I mean, this is what's prompted me to think more in terms of living diversity. I think there's too much a sense that diverse people, you know, turn up and kind of essentially perform a version of themselves that people expect and are ready to celebrate. And I think this is, in so doing, we just end up otherizing people even more. You know, there's this gentleman here who migrated from the Sudan, say 30 years ago. It seems completely daft to ask him to come and somehow represent Sudanese culture. The Sudan that he left literally does not exist anymore, right? It's much more interesting to hear about what he has to say as a Brummie and as a British citizen. But of course, this also involves, you know, his ability to make some commentary on Sudan politically, culturally, and so on. What we did then, we then asked a group of local artists to say, well, we have all these wonderful portraits and stories. If you were to turn these into educational stuff, what would that look like? So they made these wonderful packs. I mean, we all made them together, I'd like to say, but I want them to have more of the credit. We made them for key stages 1, 2, and 3, and we've been trialing them with so far, I think 320 school children. Just as a way of exploring diversity and belonging from a different perspective than certainly what we find in the established curriculum. This is just one example. It doesn't lend itself readily to every aspect of the work that you all do or people do in the university. And that's why I think I said decolonization is a gateway. It's a kind of it's a moment. It's a starting point, if you like. It's about really reflecting on, well, what does it mean to the work that I do, given the broad principles of social justice and the ideals of decolonization. And so from museumification to living diversity means working with, not on, local communities, including them as partners in the work that we do, not as objects in our research, then using the results to develop curricula, further research, publications, and crucially also to develop positive outcomes for those communities themselves. So in this sense, decolonization is a practice that extends far beyond the campus. So just to conclude then, colonialism, its knowledges, its epistemologies have been and continue to be destructive, I think it's fair to say. We witness this destruction not only in the systematic dismantling of indigenous cultures and knowledges of the global South, but also physically and materially. In the destruction of economies, for example, like we've seen with the structural adjustment policies of the IMF throughout the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. And indeed, climate change. But sadly, there are still plenty of people who've made it their life's mission, it seems, to enable that legacy to continue and even to gather momentum. Whenever I say that sentence, the name Suella Braverman pops up into my head, but you make your own judgments. She's just the latest example, like Ron DeSantis and all these other people. You know, just the latest examples of a deeply rooted malaise, I think, in Western politics. So I think this is why it's really crucial that we create counter knowledges and counter practices that are destructive in their own right. I'm by no means the first person to say this. I mean, Fanon said it God knows how many years ago, that we are destructive of colonialism. And I've tried to offer sort of two tiny little ways of, you know, pathways rather towards this sort of thing. So firstly, in the context of Islamophobia, I argued that when we study the specific dynamics of the mutation of it throughout the history of colonialism, we understand its unique kind of facets today. And that is the only way we can tackle it properly in the context of education, social justice, and decolonization. And secondly, I argued that we have to resist the museumification of diversity in the education sector, which entails meaningfully including diverse communities in our research and teaching, repositioning the university as a contact zone in which critical dialogue takes place, in which people's voices, stories, and experiences make a legitimate and equal contribution to knowledge and research. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully get rid of that.